Lucia Vargas arrived at La Moraleja with clean shoes, a heart full of chaos, and a small lie tucked inside her coat pocket. The lie was simple. Over the phone, she had claimed more experience caring for elderly people than she actually had. But that wasn't entirely false either. She had cared for her grandmother for 4 years. She had learned to monitor blood pressure, to recognize dangerous silences, to make soups powerful enough to bring the dead back to life, and to argue with arrogant doctors without ever losing her composure. But working in a mansion in La Moraleja? That was something else entirely. Something with black iron gates, security cameras, perfectly trimmed trees, and a fountain at the entrance that looked more expensive than the entire building where Lucia actually lived. She got off the bus 2 streets early because her phone's navigation decided to betray her at the worst possible moment. She walked through the afternoon sun, clutching a folder against her chest, desperately trying not to look impressed by the enormous home surrounding her. It didn't work. Good Lord, she muttered. Even the bushes here probably have lawyers. When she reached the address, the gate was already open. That struck her as strange, but also a blessing, because she couldn't find the buzzer and was already sweating from nerves. She stepped inside carefully, the way you'd enter a museum where everything might shatter if you breathed wrong. That's when she saw him. A man stood beside a black car, sleek, gleaming, far too polished to belong to any ordinary person. His white shirt was rolled to the forearms. His dark hair was slightly disheveled. And his expression of mild irritation was so perfectly composed it looked rehearsed in front of a mirror. He was wiping a small smudge from the windshield with a cloth. Lucia stopped. He looked up. For 2 full seconds, neither of them spoke. And in those 2 seconds, Lucia made her first mistake of the afternoon. She assumed he was the driver. Not because he looked like a driver, in truth, he looked like someone who could buy the car, the street, and probably fire the mayor for being late. But he was standing beside the car. He was wiping the windshield. And she needed someone to explain where on earth the main entrance was. Good afternoon, Lucia said, trying to sound professional. I'm here for the interview. I'm applying to care for Dona Aurora. The man looked at her with a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and something more dangerous. Interest. You're Lucia Vargas. Yes. You're 7 minutes late. Lucia blinked. Fantastic. So the driver keeps time obsessively and polishes windows with incredible passion. Quite the combination. The man stopped moving the cloth. He looked at her. Lucia held his gaze, though internally she was already composing her mental farewell. Dear job opportunity, it was brief, but intense. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not much. Just enough to completely ruin Lucia's concentration. The main entrance is that way, he said, tilting his head. Thank you. Lucia took 2 steps, then stopped. He wasn't making any move to help her with her folder, her bag, or the tote carrying her comfortable backup shoes. She turned back. You're not going to walk me to the door. I don't know how things work around here, but in normal houses, when someone comes for an interview, they don't just leave them wandering the garden like some kind of administrative ghost. The man opened his mouth. Then closed it. For the first time in a very long time, Daniel Altamirano had no immediate response. For those who didn't know him, that meant nothing. For those who did, it was a historic event. Daniel Altamirano was the president of Grupo Altamirano, owner of hotels, private clinics, and half a dozen companies that converted stress into dividends. Men twice his age asked permission before sitting in his presence. Directors with 3 master's degrees grew nervous when he frowned. And yet, this woman had just told him to walk her to the door as if he were part of the household furniture. The worst part? Daniel walked. He didn't know why. But he walked. Lucia strolled alongside him down the stone path, glancing sideways at the enormous house. Nice place, she said. Very understated, especially if you want it visible from Portugal. Daniel let out a low laugh. He immediately regretted it. He didn't laugh with strangers. Not in his home. Not before a job interview. Not with women who arrived late and insulted him with such natural ease. Dona Aurora doesn't believe in understatement, he replied. I can see that. She paused. You've worked for her long. Daniel turned his head slightly. And there it was, the confusion, the opportunity, the absurdity. He could have said, I'm her son. He could have said, I own this house. He could have said, actually, I'm the one conducting the interview. But before he could open his mouth, the front door swung open. A woman appeared in the doorway. Dona Aurora Altamirano was 74 years old, with an elegant walking cane, lips painted red, and the precise expression of a queen who had just discovered free entertainment. She looked at Lucia. Then at Daniel. Then at the polishing cloth he was still holding. She understood everything immediately. Because mothers, especially dangerously intelligent mothers, don't need context. A poorly assembled scene and an uncomfortable son are more than enough. Lucia Vargas, she said warmly. You're late. Lucia straightened. I'm so sorry. The bus. Don't explain it to me. The best people in my life have always arrived late. The punctual ones tend to be insufferable. Lucia wasn't sure if that was a welcome or a verdict. Aurora descended a step, leaning on her cane. I see you've already met Daniel. Lucia glanced at the man beside her. Daniel looked at his mother with a silent warning that said clearly, Don't, Mama. Aurora smiled and did it anyway. My driver. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when a lie walks into a room wearing expensive shoes. He also sometimes believes he runs this house, Aurora added with an amused expression, but don't pay him any mind. Daniel went completely still. Lucia, on the other hand, smiled with relief. Ah. That makes sense. That really does make sense. What? Daniel asked. Nothing. It just adds up. What adds up? The attitude. Aurora pressed her lips together, fighting a smile. Daniel briefly stopped breathing. Lucia, entirely unaware of the social catastrophe she had just set in motion, extended her hand to Dona Aurora. It's a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure will be mine, as long as you don't treat me like antique china. I hate when people speak to me slowly just because I have white hair. Perfect, Lucia replied. And I hate people who pretend to be fragile to manipulate others. Aurora's eyes went wide. Then she smiled. Daniel looked at Lucia too, but differently this time, the way you look at a spark catching fire in a room that's been dark for years. I like her, Aurora declared. You haven't even interviewed me yet. I just did. Lucia blinked. Daniel, Aurora said, still watching Lucia. Take her things inside. Daniel didn't move. Aurora tilted her head. Or do I need to explain how arms work? Without ceremony, Lucia handed the bag to the supposed driver. Thank you, Daniel. He took it. The most feared CEO in Madrid took a tote bag with comfortable backup shoes from a woman who thought he was his mother's chauffeur. And the most troubling part wasn't even that. The most troubling part was this: when Lucia walked into the mansion without looking back, Daniel found himself smiling. Right there, that's exactly where the problem began. Because Daniel Altamirano had built his entire life on one simple rule: control everything before everything could touch him. But that afternoon, a woman with a cheap folder, a sharp tongue, and tired shoes had walked into his home and called him a driver. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't want to correct anyone. If you want to see how a man who runs an empire without breaking a sweat tries to survive a woman who knocked him off his throne in under 5 minutes, leave your like and subscribe. Because Daniel doesn't know yet that his hardest job won't be running companies. It will be not falling in love with the woman who thinks he just opens doors. Dona Aurora's sitting room was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who decorated with taste and without asking anyone's opinion. The paintings on the walls were ones Lucia couldn't identify, but which smelled expensive. The floor-to-ceiling bookcase held books that looked genuinely read, not bought by the meter for decoration. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase, and the air carried the scent of something that might have been coffee, or might have been the fragrance of an ordered life. Lucia sat on the edge of the sofa. Not the center. Not leaned back. The edge, spine straight, folder balanced on her knees, the posture of someone who knows she's being evaluated even when the other person is pouring your tea. Dona Aurora poured it herself, without calling for anyone. That detail pleased Lucia. Daniel leaned in the doorframe without sitting. Arms crossed. Watching. Lucia noticed. Of course she noticed. But she decided to ignore him with the efficiency of someone who had ignored far more complicated things than an attractive man with a judge's expression. So, said Aurora, settling into her chair with the elegance of someone who has never been in a hurry in her life. Tell me why I should hire you. Lucia took a breath. Because I cared for my grandmother for 4 years without missing a single day. Because I taught myself how to manage her medications, her mood swings, and her doctor's appointments. Because I never treated her like a burden, even on the days when she was one. And because difficult people don't scare me. Aurora raised an eyebrow. Are you calling me difficult? I'm telling you it wouldn't frighten me if you were. A pause. Aurora sipped her tea. Good. And what can't you do? Lucia blinked. That was a strange question. An honest one. I can't make French pastries. I can't drive. And I can't stay quiet when someone says something I know is wrong. Excellent, said Aurora. I detest French pastries. Daniel drives the car. And you've already proven me right 3 times in the last 2 minutes without waiting to be asked. From the doorframe, Daniel exhaled, something between a cough and a surrender. Lucia, laser-focused on the job, didn't so much as glance his way. Do you have a partner? Aurora asked. The question arrived without warning, the way dangerous questions always do. No, Lucia answered. Is that relevant to the position? For the position, no. For me, yes. Why? Because people with partners always have their head somewhere else. And I need someone who's truly here, not someone sneaking texts in the bathroom. I don't have a partner and I don't sneak texts anywhere, Lucia said. Although if the job requires it, I'll let you know before I use the bathroom. Aurora let out a short, genuine laugh, the kind that can't be manufactured. From his corner, Daniel smiled too. This time, he didn't regret it. There was something about this woman that rearranged the order of things. It wasn't her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the way she spoke. Direct. Unafraid. Without trying too hard to please. As though she already knew that her worth had nothing to do with anyone's approval in that room. I have a question, Lucia said, looking at Aurora. Do you actually need a caregiver, or do you need company? Aurora didn't answer immediately. What's the difference? A caregiver does what she's told. A companion listens, argues, laughs, and sometimes says no. If what you need is the first option, I can do that job. If what you need is the second, I can do that too. But I want to know what I'm agreeing to. Silence. A different kind of silence than before, heavier and more honest. Aurora set down her cup. My son believes I need supervision, she said quietly. I believe I need someone who doesn't treat me as though I'm already half gone. Then I'm the right person, Lucia said. Because from where I'm sitting, you seem more alive than most people I've ever met. It was then that Daniel pushed himself away from the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. For the first time since Lucia had arrived, he took up space in the conversation differently, not as a referee, but as someone who actually wanted to listen. "Why did you leave your grandmother?" he asked. His voice was quieter than before. No hardness in it. Just the question. Lucia looked at him. "Because she died," she said simply. "When that happened, I lost my job, my housing, and the absolute certainty that I would do it all again if I could." She paused briefly. "I've had the rent at its limit for 3 months. I'm also covering part of my mother's apartment, she's been alone since my father left. And there's a geriatric care course I haven't been able to afford yet. That's why I need this job. Not as an excuse. As a reality." No one said anything. Aurora looked at her son. Daniel looked at Lucia. Lucia looked at the cup of tea that hadn't been offered to her yet. "Give her some tea," Aurora told Daniel, in the tone of someone who doesn't suggest, but decides. And Daniel, CEO with the expensive suits and the impossible schedule, stood up, took the teapot, and poured a cup for the woman who thought he was his mother's employee. There are moments in life that don't seem important when they happen. Small moments. Domestic. Almost invisible. A cup of tea poured by the wrong person at the unexpected moment. No one knows, in that instant, that the smallest gesture is about to change everything. "The job is yours," Aurora said. Lucia looked up. "You don't want to see my references?" "I already saw them." "When?" Aurora smiled with the calm of someone who always plays with a lead. "Before you arrived, obviously. I'm old, not foolish. But I wanted to see who you were in person. Papers say what people want them to say. People tell the truth when they still think they're being tested." Lucia held her gaze. "And if I'd failed the test? Then you'd be riding the bus home with a good cup of tea in your stomach and no wasted time." Lucia nodded slowly. "I like you, Donna Aurora." "Of course you do. I'm delightful." Daniel, who had returned to his chair, looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had spent 74 years living with exactly that and still hadn't found the right response. Lucia started work the next morning. She arrived on time. The navigation cooperated. Her routine with Aurora was established quickly: breakfast at 9, reading or conversation in the morning, a light lunch, a short nap, a walk through the garden when the body allowed, and a calm dinner. No hospital stiffness. No speaking to Aurora as though she were made of glass. Aurora appreciated this without saying so directly. She said it in other ways, letting Lucia push back on the medication schedule when she was right, inviting her to sit beside her instead of waiting in the kitchen, asking her opinion on the books she was reading. Coming from Donna Aurora, that was a great deal. The complicating element of this story, the problem, if you wanted to call it that, was Daniel. Daniel Altamirano appeared at the mansion on an irregular schedule. Some days he arrived at noon directly from a meeting, tie loosened, phone pressed to his ear. Some nights he appeared late, unannounced. Sometimes he worked from an office somewhere in a wing of the house Lucia hadn't yet explored. What Lucia had noticed was this: every time Daniel was in the house, something shifted in the air. She couldn't have explained it precisely. It was like the drop in pressure before rain. No water yet, but the body already feels it. And since she still believed he was the driver, she treated him accordingly. On the third day, while trying to move a heavy dresser in Aurora's room because the light falls differently now and I don't like it anymore, Lucia poked her head into the hallway and found Daniel reading in the sitting room. "Daniel." He looked up from the document he was reviewing. "Could you help me with something?" A pause. "Depends on what." "A dresser. It's heavy and I don't want to throw out my back." Daniel looked at the document. Looked at Lucia. Made a decision none of his executive team would have understood. "Where?" The dresser weighed what old dressers weigh, too much, with the added burden of everything accumulated inside by people who never bothered to empty them first. Lucia discovered this when she tried to lift one side and the piece of furniture refused to move, with the dignity of something that had spent decades in the same spot. Daniel entered the room, assessed the situation, and took the heavier side without a word. To the other wall, Lucia instructed. By the window. Fine. Moving the dresser was an exercise in silent coordination. Two people who barely knew each other navigating a narrow space with the weight of a piece of furniture between them and the obligation not to step on each other's feet. Lucia watched the dresser. Daniel watched the dresser. At some point along the way, their hands found the same corner of the piece at the same angle. Neither mentioned it. But both felt it. There, said Lucia when they reached the spot. They set it down. Daniel straightened and looked at his palms, lightly reddened. In his adult life, he had never moved a piece of furniture. He had people for that. He had an entire corporate structure designed to ensure he never had to carry anything heavier than a decision. Thank you, said Lucia, studying the result with a critical eye. Although now that I see it, maybe a little more to the left. Daniel looked at her. Are you joking? Just about 20 centimeters, Daniel. A pause. That dresser weighs roughly the same as a corporate merger decision. Lucia looked at him without fully catching the reference, but she caught the tone. Fine, she said. Let's leave it there. Daniel exhaled. Lucia was already heading for the door when she turned back. Oh, and Daniel. If you have time this afternoon, Aurora wants someone to go to the market. She needs a few things, and I have to stay with her while the doctor comes. He blinked. I don't go to the market. Why not? Because, a pause. It's not part of my responsibilities. Lucia gave him a look that said clearly, what a strange man. What exactly are your responsibilities? Daniel opened his mouth. Closed it. He had 42 possible answers, all correct, all impossible to deliver in that moment without revealing who he was. I'll find the list tomorrow, he said finally. Wonderful, replied Lucia, and disappeared down the hallway with the lightness of someone who has just won something, without knowing there was even a competition. There is a specific kind of defeat that doesn't hurt, that is, in fact, curiously satisfying. Daniel Altamirano was discovering it late. But with an efficiency that would have impressed him in any other context. The following day, he went to the market alone, with a handwritten list from Aurora that included items like, tomatoes that don't look like they're made of plastic, and, that cheese Lucia likes, you know the one. He didn't know the one. He had to ask at the cheese counter with the authority of a man accustomed to negotiating contracts and the complete ignorance of someone who had never bought cheese in his life. He came back with 3 different kinds, just in case. Lucia spotted them on the kitchen counter and smiled. You brought 3. I didn't know which was right. The one from next door. The classic semi-cured manchego. Daniel looked at her. Which one is the one from next door? The one without the fancy label. They all had fancy labels. Lucia picked up one of the cheeses, smelled it, and nodded. This one. This is right. How do you know? Because it smells like actual cheese. Not like marketing. Daniel looked at her a moment longer than necessary, then went quiet, because there was something in that answer, in the simple way she distinguished the real from the manufactured, that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite categorize. He was surrounded by fancy labels. And until that moment, it had never seemed like a problem. Donna Aurora Altamirano was 74 years old, with mild arthritis in her right hand and the strategic precision of a retired general who has decided that her final campaign will be her son's love life. She watched everything. She watched how Daniel began appearing in the kitchen at hours he'd never appeared before. How his phone calls, once made while striding through the garden with long steps and a faraway gaze, were now made from the sitting room, where he had a clear view of the hallway Lucia passed through. She watched how he stopped checking his phone the moment Lucia entered a room. For a woman who had watched her son grow into the convenient coldness of someone who decided feelings were a management risk, this was the equivalent of fireworks. The operation began with subtlety. I have a headache, Aurora announced one afternoon with an expression of moderate suffering. I need ibuprofen, water, and perhaps something to go with it. I'll get it right now, said Lucia, standing. No, let Daniel bring it. You rest for a moment. You've been on your feet all morning. Lucia blinked. I'm fine, really. Sit down, Lucia, Aurora said in the tone of someone who doesn't debate. Lucia sat. Aurora called for Daniel with the same authority she must have used when he was 8 years old and had broken something expensive. Daniel arrived, assessed the situation, and went for the ibuprofen with a resignation that was starting to look a great deal like habit. When he returned with the water and the tablet, Aurora looked at Lucia. Don't you think Daniel has the face of a man who needs someone to ruin his life with love? Lucia choked on her tea. Daniel stood there holding the glass, looking at his mother with an expression that begged for legal intervention. Mama, that's not an observation, that's an assault. The most uncomfortable observations are the most honest things in the world. Lucia, having recovered from her coughing fit, managed to articulate, I think Daniel has the face of a man who would prefer not to be in this conversation. Exactly, he said. That's also a symptom, Aurora noted, swallowing the tablet with an elegance that made it perfectly clear her headache was entirely optional. For those keeping score at home, Aurora 1, Daniel 0, Lucia still unaware she's playing the game. The operation continued days later with an informal dinner. Informal, in Aurora's vocabulary, meant she had summoned the cook at 3 in the afternoon to prepare something simple, which turned out to include 3 courses, artisan bread, and a dessert that took 40 minutes to assemble. We'll eat together, the 3 of us, she announced as though it were the most natural thing in the world. There are so few of us in this house, and there's no reason for everyone to eat alone. Daniel, who had a call scheduled with investors in New York that evening, looked at his watch. Aurora looked at him. The call was postponed. The dinner was set at the large dining table. Aurora had insisted on no ceremony, which meant there were still candles, flowers, and a bottle of wine that Lucia recognized as expensive simply because it had no price on the label. Wines without prices are always the most expensive ones. Do you drink wine? Daniel asked, bottle in hand. A little, said Lucia. Though I'll admit I know nothing about wine. Even better, he said. People who know too much never enjoy it. She looked at him. He was already pouring, his attention focused on the glass. Aurora observed from her chair with the expression of someone watching a show she'd been waiting weeks to see. During dinner they talked about small things, the books Aurora was reading, a neighbor who had planted a tree that blocked light into the garden, the city, the noise, how Madrid had changed. Lucia spoke naturally, without calculating, without the filter people tend to apply when they're eating with wealthy people. Daniel listened in a way that wasn't his usual mode, without interrupting, without watching the clock, without glancing at his phone, which sat face down next to his plate. Where are you from? He asked at some point between the first and second course. Vallecas. Why do you ask? She added, because it was only fair. Curiosity. He paused. And you? From here, actually. Though I spent years away. Where? London, New York, Tokyo for a while. Lucia nodded slowly. And why did you come back? Daniel glanced at his mother before answering. For her, he said. Simply. Without emphasis. A fact. But Lucia caught something in the brevity of that answer she couldn't quite name. Aurora sipped her wine with the expression of a queen who has just received the tribute she was owed. My son, she said, has the gift of saying important truths in very few words. The problem is that the truths that cost him most, he keeps to himself too long. Daniel set his fork down. Mama, I'm making conversation. Not group therapy. Is there a difference? Lucia bit her lip to keep from laughing, and succeeded at exactly the opposite. The laughter caught her off guard, brief and genuine, without a trace of calculation. And Daniel looked at her in that precise moment. Not the way an employer evaluates a new employee. Not the way a man tolerates someone new in the house. It was the look of someone who has just seen something he didn't expect to see and doesn't yet know what to do with it. He kept it, the way he kept everything that cost him something. It rained on a Tuesday. Madrid rains with conviction when it decides to, without warning, without apology, with the determination of a city that has made up its mind to soak you, even if you're carrying an umbrella. Lucia had stayed later than usual. Aurora had experienced a difficult moment that afternoon, nothing serious, but enough for Lucia to decide to stay until she saw her calm and asleep. When she stepped into the hallway, it was 11:15 at night. The mansion was silent. The kind of expensive silence found only in large houses, no upstairs neighbors, no noisy pipes, no echoes of anyone else's life. She found Daniel in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with a half-finished cup of coffee and his phone face down on the surface, which, for him, was the equivalent of having turned off the world. "How is she?" he asked when he heard her. "Asleep." "Fine. It was just the stress of this afternoon, nothing more." He nodded. "Are you leaving now?" "Yes. I'll call a cab." Daniel looked toward the window. Rain hammered the glass with insistence. "I'll take you." "You don't have to." "Lucia. It's 11 at night and it's pouring. I have an umbrella." "An umbrella doesn't get you to Vallecas." She was ready to insist. She had the entire mental framework prepared. But there was something in the way he said it, not with calculated generosity, not with the tone of someone doing a favor and expecting gratitude, that made her resistance soften. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The car left La Moraleja in silence, not the uncomfortable silence of two people with nothing to say to each other. The other kind. The silence that settles between people who could speak, but choose not to, because the moment is fine exactly as it is. Outside, it rained. The lights of Madrid reflected off the wet asphalt, multiplied and distorted, transformed into something closer to a painting than a city. Lucia watched through the window. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Yes." "Why do you stay at the house? I mean, you don't strike me as the type of person who lives with his mother." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Aurora has her difficult days. I prefer to be close." "And your life? Don't you have, I don't know, a life of your own outside of here?" He took a moment. "I have work." "Work isn't the same thing." "No," he admitted. "It's not." Lucia turned back to the rain. "When I lost my grandmother, I spent months not knowing what to do with the empty time. My entire routine had revolved around her, and suddenly there was nothing to organize. It felt strange, like the air took up more space than it should." Daniel didn't answer immediately. "And now?" he asked. "Now I'm here," she said with a small smile. "Which is another way of saying I still don't have the answer, but at least I have somewhere to be in the mornings." He turned his head toward her for just a second. 1 second. But in that second he saw her clearly, tired, honest, without the shield of professionalism she carried through the day. A woman who carried weight without complaining, and had the courage to admit it without drama. He looked back at the road. "My father died 6 years ago," he said, without anyone having asked. "And it took me 3 years to stop working as though I could recover the time I hadn't been there." Lucia said nothing. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I understand." Not any of the things people say when they don't know what else to say. She simply let his words exist in the car, in the rain, without needing anyone to resolve them. That was, though Daniel didn't fully know it yet, exactly what he needed. At some point on the drive, the warmth of the car and the rhythm of the rain did what they do. Lucia closed her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself. And she fell asleep, cheek against the cold glass, breathing slow. Daniel noticed when the traffic lights changed and she didn't stir. He reduced his speed without reason. He took the long way, through parallel streets that weren't the most direct, but were the quietest. He glanced at her at each red light, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the need for that drive not to end. Be careful with late-night drives in the rain. They're dangerous. Not because of the wet asphalt, but because they have the habit of becoming unforgettable without asking permission. When they reached Lucia's street, he parked slowly. Lucia. She opened her eyes gradually. Took a second to orient herself. Looked at the street, the building, the rain still falling. Oh, I'm sorry. I fell asleep. I know. She straightened, slightly embarrassed. How unprofessional. You've been taking care of my mother day and night for weeks. I think you've earned it. She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at that mansion, she had no idea what to say. Thank you for the ride, she said finally. Good night, Lucia. She stepped out, opened her umbrella. Before closing the door, she turned back. Daniel? Yes. You're a strange driver. He opened his mouth. He was 1 second away from saying, Lucia, there's something I need to tell you. But she was already closing the door, already opening the umbrella fully, already crossing the street in that light-footed rush of someone who doesn't realize she has just interrupted something important. He was left with the words still on his lips. He kept them, the way he kept everything that cost him something. He waited until she disappeared through the building's entrance. Then he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, watching the rain, knowing exactly the moment he had lost control, and knowing also, with an uncomfortable clarity, that he had been given the chance to be honest, and had let it go. Dr. Andres Villanueva arrived on a Thursday morning. He was Aurora's geriatrician, young for the specialty, with the easy smile of someone who had learned that older patients respond better to warmth and efficiency, and the kind of tidy appearance that mothers mention casually when they talk about a good match. He wasn't Aurora's regular doctor. The regular one was on holiday, and Villanueva was his substitute. He arrived at 11, examined Aurora with patience and professionalism, and explained the medication adjustments with a clarity that Lucia quietly appreciated. She dealt with too many doctors who explained things as though the patient's family were an administrative inconvenience. Any doubts, he told Lucia at the end, don't hesitate to call me. He handed her his personal card. Thank you, doctor. Andres, he corrected with a smile. Thank you, Andres, Lucia repeated. From the hallway, where he had appeared without anyone calling for him, Daniel watched the exchange with the expression of someone reviewing a contract and finding a clause he doesn't like. Aurora had naturally seen him arrive. Daniel, come meet Dr. Villanueva. Daniel entered with measured steps and extended his hand. Altamirano. Villanueva. The doctor didn't flinch. Are you family of the Senora? Her son. Ah. He nodded. No need to worry, she's doing very well. Her caregiver does excellent work. He looked at Lucia as he said it. Lucia smiled. Daniel looked at Lucia. Lucia did not look at Daniel. Does he have experience with patients like Aurora? Daniel asked the doctor, in the tone of someone initiating due diligence. 12 years in geriatrics, Villanueva replied, unruffled. But if you have any questions about the treatment, I'm happy to walk you through it. I have no questions. Perfect. He smiled. Then I'll be on my way, knowing she's in good hands. He said goodbye to Aurora with a small bow, said goodbye to Lucia with a smile that lasted 2 seconds longer than strictly necessary, and left. The silence that remained had texture. What a pleasant doctor, said Aurora. Said Daniel. Wouldn't you agree, Lucia? Very clear when he explains things, said Lucia, tucking the card into her apron pocket. Daniel looked at the pocket. He gave you his personal card. For questions about the medication. The regular doctor has a consultation line for that. The regular doctor is on holiday. For that, there are on-call services. Lucia looked at him calmly. Daniel, is there a problem? A pause. No. Good. She turned to Aurora. Would you like tea, or would you prefer to rest a bit before lunch? Tea, said Aurora, watching her son with the expression of a woman who has spent 74 years understanding men. And perhaps a biscuit, to celebrate the doctor's good news. Daniel stood in the middle of the sitting room. Where are you going? Aurora asked. To work. You've been here 20 minutes. I have things pending. Daniel, darling. She tilted her head. Why do you have the face of a man whose heart has just been parked in a no-stopping zone? Mama, I'm going to work. Yes, I heard you. And he went. There are people who, when they feel something they don't want to feel, go to work, as though somewhere inside a contract they might find the answer to a question that has nothing to do with contracts. Daniel was an expert at that. Until he stopped being one. That afternoon, from his study, Daniel opened the house phone log for no specific reason. He didn't call anyone. He closed the screen. Opened a financial report. Closed that too. And sat staring at the wall with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand he has a problem, and isn't quite ready to admit it. It was Aurora who proposed that Daniel learn to make soup. The suggestion arrived at breakfast with the same casual ease as proposing they repaint the walls, or invade a small country. Lucia cooks beautifully and you are completely useless in the kitchen. It would be a shame to waste the opportunity. I don't need to know how to cook, said Daniel, eyes on his coffee. Everyone needs to know how to cook. It's the difference between being an adult and being someone who orders takeout at 2 in the morning. I don't order takeout at 2 in the morning. What time do you order it? Silence. Lucia, said Aurora. Would you mind? Lucia looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Lucia. And that is how that evening, with Aurora resting in her room, the door strategically left ajar, Daniel Altamirano learned to make French onion soup under the supervision of a woman who regarded him as a restoration project of moderate complexity. Start with the onions, said Lucia, tying one of the kitchen aprons around him, a navy blue one that was slightly too tight across the shoulders and somehow made him look less like a CEO and more like a human being. How many? 3. Slice them thin, Julienne. What? Fine strips. She looked at him. Seriously, you don't know what Julienne means. I know what it means in general culinary terms. I didn't know it was the specific technique you were going to ask for. It's the only technique for onions in this soup. You could have just said that from the start. I could have. But this way you learn more. Daniel picked up the knife. Lucia watched him for 2 seconds and then, with the instinct of someone who had taught her grandmother to use a smartphone more than once, she stepped beside him and adjusted the angle of his hand on the handle. Like this, she said. Don't grip it like it's trying to escape. I'm not gripping it like that. You are. Relax your fingers. He did. And neither of them said anything about how close they were now, their hands nearly overlapping on the same knife, their arms almost touching, the heat of the kitchen mixing with something that had no name yet, but which was taking up space. Good, said Lucia, and stepped back. He cut the onion badly at first. Better after that. With the focus of someone who isn't used to learning basic things and doesn't want to fail in front of this particular person. Not bad, Lucia conceded. Just not bad. For a first time, it's quite good. She paused. If this were a business negotiation. It's not. But if it were, I'd say you have potential, but you need practice. I'll take that. The onion went into the pan. The oil crackled. The smell spread through the kitchen with the quiet authority of everyday scents that somehow feel more intimate than any expensive perfume. Now you wait, said Lucia. Low heat. No rushing. I'm not good at waiting. I can see that. How? You've been staring at that pan for 30 seconds as if you can speed up time by looking hard enough. Daniel exhaled, something halfway between a laugh and a surrender. Are you always like this? This direct? Yes. It's a problem. No, he said. It's a relief. She looked at him. Said nothing. But something shifted in the weight of the silence, the way the wind changes direction before anyone notices. They continued with the soup, broth, toasted bread, grated cheese. Daniel followed instructions with an attention he didn't usually give to things that didn't matter to him. Lucia noticed, though she didn't say so. When the soup was done and set to rest, Lucia leaned against the counter. Daniel turned toward her. The kitchen was small in proportion to the mansion, built to function, not to impress. And in that moment, the two of them occupied the same space in a way that was not accidental. Try it, she said, handing him the wooden spoon. He took it. Tasted. It's good. It's good, she corrected. For your first time making it. With your help. With my help, he admitted. They looked at each other. Neither moved away. The wooden spoon hung between them. The soup sat in the pot. The silence was the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Daniel took one small step toward her. He didn't plan it. It was the kind of movement the body makes before the mind has time to stop it. Lucia didn't step back. He raised his hand and gently moved a strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek. A small gesture. Slow. Unnecessary from any practical perspective. She held her breath. Lucia, he began, his voice lower than before. If you two are going to kiss, came Aurora's voice from the hallway, please do it before my tea gets cold. Lucia took a step back. Daniel closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Your tea is on the nightstand, he called toward the hallway. It might be cold. I don't know that from here. Lucia was already on the other side of the kitchen, intensely preoccupied with checking whether the pot needed something it absolutely did not need. I'll bring her the tea, she said, without looking at Daniel. And she left the kitchen with the speed of someone who has decided the best plan is not to have one. Daniel stood alone before the pot of soup. He looked at the wooden spoon. He looked at the door she had walked through. There are moments that stay unfinished, interrupted at exactly the point where they hurt the most, and for that precise reason, never forgotten. The signs had been there all along. Lucia would understand this later. Of course, it's always understood later. There was the morning when Carmela, the woman who came to clean on Thursdays, walked into the sitting room while Daniel was reading and began to say, "Good morning, Senor Alt," before Daniel could look up with an expression that Carmela read perfectly, converting the rest of the sentence into a polite cough and an immediate change of subject. Lucia had witnessed it from the hallway and thought, this driver must have a temper that frightens even the household staff. There was also the Tuesday newspaper. Lucia had left it open on the breakfast table, and on the business page was a photo, a man in profile, dark suit, walking into a glass building. The caption read, Daniel Altamirano, president of Grupo Altamirano, at the launch of his new hotel project. The photo was small and taken from the side. Lucia glanced at it for a second. Thought, that's quite a well-known surname. Turned the page. And there was the security guard at the building where Aurora had a medical checkup one Friday morning. When Daniel walked through the entrance, the guard shot to his feet with a speed that went well beyond protocol. Sir, good morning. I'll notify the doctor right away. Daniel responded with a brief gesture, and the guard sat back down as though he had just fulfilled an important duty. Lucia, walking 2 steps behind, thought, even security guards in this city have strange hierarchies. And didn't give it another thought. The signs had been there. But seeing what you don't expect to see is the kind of effort no one makes voluntarily. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday. Altamirano Foundation Charity Gala. Friday the 21st, evening. Palacio de Cibeles. Aurora showed it to Lucia with the expression of someone presenting an unmissable business opportunity. You'll come with me. Dona Aurora, that's a formal gala. I don't have a. I have a dress I never wore. It belonged to a friend who is no longer here. She left it to me because she knew I'd know when to use it. When Aurora showed her the dress, Lucia went still. It was dark blue, the depth of the sea at night. Simple in its lines, but made from the kind of fabric that falls differently. The kind that doesn't try to impress. That simply is. I can't wear your friend's dress. Of course you can. She was a practical woman. She would have hated to see it staying in a wardrobe. Aurora paused. Besides, Daniel won't be there. He has his commitments. It'll just be you and me. What Aurora did not mention, with the elegance of someone who omits information as a form of strategy, was that Daniel would, in fact, be at that gala. He would simply arrive separately, in his capacity as president of the foundation. And finding Lucia there would not, in any sense, be a coincidence. It was the most ambitious maneuver Aurora had executed throughout the entire operation. And she carried it out with the serenity of someone who has spent 74 years knowing that patience is the only real form of power. The Palacio de Cibeles was exactly the kind of place that leaves no one indifferent. Lucia walked in on Aurora's arm, wearing the blue dress and a pair of borrowed shoes that pinched slightly, but would survive the night. And for the first time in a long time, she felt invisible in the best possible way. Part of the scenery. The center of nothing. She liked that. She met people whose names she didn't recognize but whose suits were worth more than 3 months of her rent. She held brief, pleasant conversations without pretending to belong anywhere. She looked after Aurora with her usual quiet care. Everything was going smoothly. And then the presenter called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the president of the Altamirano Foundation, Daniel Altamirano. Lucia looked up. And she saw him, in a dark suit, impeccable, with that natural authority she had noticed since the very first day, but had filed mentally under driver with excessive attitude. He walked to the stage. The room applauded. Lucia did not applaud. Because her hands had stopped receiving instructions from her brain. He spoke, about the foundation, about the year's work, about future projects. He did it with the same calm he brought to everything, without visible effort, without needing silence's approval to continue. And while he spoke, he searched the audience. For a fraction of a second, when he found Lucia, his perfect composure broke. Just 1 second. Just for her. But Lucia was no longer processing nuance. She was processing the entire inventory of the past weeks. The car. The mansion. The natural authority. The mysterious phone calls made in low voices. The suits that no driver would own. The way everyone in that house, from the gardener to the cleaning woman, had looked at him with a deference she had attributed to a difficult personality. Everything fit. Everything fit. And that was worse than nothing fitting at all. Well, Aurora murmured beside her, champagne glass in hand and the expression of someone watching the final act of a play she had written herself. I technically never said he was a good driver. Lucia looked at her. Aurora had the decency not to smile. Almost. You knew? Lucia asked, in a voice so low it barely existed. I'm his mother, darling. I know everything. I let you get to know the real him, which is a privilege very few people ever get. Lucia let out a slow breath. On stage, Daniel had finished his speech and was stepping down to applause. Their eyes met again across the distance. This time, he didn't look away. She did. She found him in a side corridor, near a door that opened to a terrace overlooking the Gran Via. She didn't look for him. Or she did, but told herself she wasn't while she was doing it. Lucia. Daniel. She paused. Or should I say Señor Altamirano? President. Owner of everything surrounding me at this moment. He didn't answer that. Can we talk? I think that's the minimum. They stepped out onto the terrace. Madrid shimmered below, indifferent, beautiful, completely unconcerned with the state of things between these two people. "When were you going to tell me?" Lucia asked. "I don't know if I was," he said, with an honesty that was almost cruel. "That is the worst possible answer." "I know. Why? Why didn't you correct me from the beginning?" Daniel put his hands on the railing and looked at the city. "At first, because I wanted to see if you could be trusted. Whether you were here for my mother's money or for the actual work." A pause. "And afterward?" Silence. "Afterward, because with you it was different. You were the only person in a long time who spoke to me without knowing who I was. Without calculating what was safe to say. Without being afraid of me." Lucia looked at him. "And that gave you the right to lie to me?" "I didn't lie. I never said I was the driver." "You didn't correct it. Which is the same thing." "It's not exactly the same thing, Daniel." Her voice cracked, just barely, just for a moment. "I fell in love with a simple man who looked at me like I was someone. Not the important man. Not the president. The man who went to the market and came back with 3 cheeses because he didn't know which one was right. The man who moved furniture without complaining. The man who listened without interrupting. That man is also me. How am I supposed to know that now? How am I supposed to know which part was real and which part was a convenient disguise? All of that was real. But the foundation was a lie." Her voice came out louder than she intended. "You let me fall in love with a version of you that was built on a misunderstanding you chose to maintain. That's not freedom, Daniel. That's a trap." He didn't answer. Because he had no answer. Because she was right. He had known it for weeks, and had chosen to do nothing, because what he had with her was the closest thing to peace he had felt in years, and he hadn't wanted to lose it. "I'm resigning," Lucia said. "Lucia. I care deeply about Aurora. But I cannot stay in that house." "Wait." "I'm not waiting," she said. And the dignity in her voice was the kind that can't be learned. You either have it or you don't. That's what people like you do. You wait for others to adjust. To hold on. To adapt. She paused. "Good night, Señor Altamirano." And she left. Without running. Without drama. With the steady steps of someone who has made a decision that hurts, but which she will not undo. There are people whose absence leaves a space that cannot be filled, not by work, not by meetings, not by cities that gleam from terraces. Daniel Altamirano was about to learn this in the most complete way possible. That same night, back in La Moraleja, Daniel found Aurora sitting in the sitting room with the lights low and her cane leaning against the armchair. She wasn't asleep. She was waiting. "How is she?" Aurora asked. "She left." Silence. "Daniel." A pause. "I wanted to bring you together." "That's true, and I don't regret it." She let a beat pass. "But you were the one who chose to hide behind a lie." "That was not my doing." Daniel said nothing. "I lit the match," Aurora continued, her voice quieter than usual, without its usual humor. "You decided to turn off the light so no one could see the fire. And that has a cost, son. And she's the one paying it." He sat down across from his mother, for the first time in a long time without a word to say in his own defense. "What do I do?" he asked, in a voice that didn't belong to the president of anything. Aurora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with a softness she didn't use often, "Start by not asking me." 10 days passed. 10 days in which the mansion in La Moraleja had the specific silence of a place where someone is missing. Aurora didn't say it outright. But she stopped proposing informal dinners. She stopped asking Daniel to go to the market. She stopped making strategic remarks about men who need someone to ruin their lives with love. She sat in the garden in the afternoons and watched the trees with the expression of a woman who knows that her own plans have had consequences she didn't fully calculate. Daniel worked the way he had worked before Lucia arrived, without breaks, without markets, without three-person dinners, without rain-soaked nights. With the efficiency of someone who has returned to a familiar habit, because the new habits had proven too costly. But something wasn't working. It wasn't that his concentration was gone. It was that concentration tasted different now. Empty in a way he hadn't noticed before, because before, he had no point of comparison. On the 10th night, Aurora found him in the sitting room, staring at a report he hadn't actually read in 2 hours. "Daniel." "What? What are you waiting for?" He didn't answer. "You made a mistake. Not the first. Probably not the last. But this one has a solution, if you act before she decides it doesn't." "I went to find her," he said quietly. Aurora looked up. "When?" "This morning. She wasn't home. Her neighbor told me she works at a clinic, Monday through Friday. And I'm not going to show up at her workplace and cause a scene." "Why not?" "Because that's not what she needs." "Then what does she need?" Daniel put the report down on the table. "She needs me to come without the last name. Without the car. Without the mansion behind me. Just me." Aurora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with a softness she didn't often allow herself, "Then go." It was a Saturday. Lucia was at her neighborhood market, the one she knew by heart, the one with the cheese stall where there were no fancy labels, just a woman named Concha who had worked the same spot for 30 years and knew her customers by name. Lucia was choosing tomatoes when she heard her name and turned. Daniel was 3 meters away. No suit. A simple shirt. Jeans. His hair slightly wind-tossed, as though he'd walked there. No phone in hand. No assistant. Nothing to identify him as the man whose name appeared in the financial press. Just him. Lucia looked at him. "I don't want a scene," she said. "I'm not here for one." He took 2 steps toward her. Stopped at a reasonable distance, close enough to be heard, far enough not to crowd. "You were right about everything you said," he began. "There's no way to argue otherwise, because there isn't. I held on to something I should have let go of, for reasons that were mine, not yours. And that wasn't fair." Lucia said nothing. "But I need you to know something." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm not going to ask for that. I only need you to know that the only time I was truly myself was when you thought I was nobody." The market went on around them. People passed with their bags and their lists. Concha watched from her stall with the quiet interest of someone who had seen many things in 30 years of Saturdays. "I went to that market for a list my mother gave me," Daniel continued. "I didn't know which cheese was right. I had to ask. I went to the pharmacy at midnight because Aurora needed something, not because anyone required me to. I moved that dresser because you asked me to, and because I wanted to. None of that had anything to do with who I am at work, or what my name is worth." "I know," said Lucia, quietly. He looked at her. "I know," she repeated. "That's why it hurts more." A pause. "Because I fell in love with that part. And when I found out there was more, that there was all the rest of it, I didn't know whether the part I'd fallen for was real, or whether it was the side you chose to show when it was convenient." "It's real," he said. "It's the only part that is." "How do I know that?" "You don't." "Not yet," he admitted. "But I could give you time to find out." Lucia looked at him steadily. The morning sun fell at an angle, that white, honest winter light of Saturday mornings that doesn't beautify anything, but shows things exactly as they are. And Daniel, in that light, without a suit or a name or a mansion behind him, was exactly the same man who had moved a dresser without complaining and brought back 3 cheeses because he didn't know which one was right. And Aurora? Lucia asked, because she needed to say something while she sorted through what she was feeling. She told me not to come back without an answer, he said. What kind of answer? Any answer that's honest. Lucia set down the tomatoes she'd been holding. I need time, she said. Not as an excuse. As a reality. I know. And if we try again, it has to be different. No disguises. No convenient omissions. Agreed. She looked at him. And you're going to make that French onion soup alone, without my help, so I can see whether you actually learned it. Something loosened in Daniel's expression, a tension that had lived in every muscle of his face for 10 days. I practiced, he said. How many times? 4. And the third time? Almost right. And the fourth? The fourth was good. A pause. Though it took me 40 minutes longer than the onions should have needed. Lucia held her breath for a moment, and then smiled. Not a big smile. Not a surrender. A small one, the kind that can't be planned. And he saw it. And kept it, the way he kept everything that mattered. That afternoon, in Aurora's kitchen, the Senora settled in her favorite armchair in the sitting room, with the theatrical discretion of someone pretending not to hear everything. Daniel made French onion soup. Alone. With the onions already sliced julienne, which he now knew how to cut. With the broth added at the right moment, which he now knew when to add. With the toasted bread and the gratinade cheese, which this time needed no explanation. Lucia sat on the kitchen stool and watched. She didn't intervene. She didn't correct. She just looked. And what she saw was not the president of any foundation, nor the owner of any corporate group. She saw a man who had learned to wait for onions to caramelize over low heat, which, if you thought about it, was a fairly honest way of saying he had learned not to be in such a hurry. When the soup was ready, he set 2 bowls on the table and sat across from her. They tasted it in silence. It's good, said Lucia. Just good. It's very good, she corrected. For someone who made it alone, with my recipe. With your recipe and your hands, he said. Which is not the same thing. He looked at her. No, he admitted. It's not the same thing. In the sitting room, Aurora took a sip of tea with the expression of a queen who has won the final battle of a very long war. Finally, she murmured, to no one in particular, or perhaps to a friend who had never gotten to wear the blue dress. I nearly ran out of time waiting for my son to behave like a human being. What Lucia had asked for wasn't decoration. It was real. And Daniel honored it with the same concentration he'd learned to give the onions, no rushing, no forcing. There were dinners. Conversations that began with Aurora and ended when she retired at 10 with her cane and her calculated discretion, leaving the 2 of them alone. There were Sunday afternoon walks in the garden that stretched much longer than planned, because neither of them made a move to go back inside. And there was the moment when their hands met with no excuse of a dresser or a knife or a recipe. It was a February afternoon in the garden, when Lucia reached for a book that had fallen and Daniel reached for it at the same moment. Their fingers met on the cover. This time, neither of them pulled away. Lucia, he said. Daniel, she answered. Nothing else was needed. The first time they kissed was in the hallway on the ground floor, at night, as Lucia was saying goodbye and he was walking her to the door, the way he had begun to do without anyone asking. She turned to say, good night. He was closer than usual. Neither spoke. He placed his hand gently on her cheek, warm palm, fingers barely grazing her hair, and looked at her for one full second that was worth a very long time. And he kissed her slowly, without urgency, without the kind of rush that belongs to people trying to get somewhere. With the calm of someone who is already exactly where he wanted to be. Lucia closed her eyes and answered, because the body, when it is finally given permission to do what it has wanted for weeks, doesn't need anyone to show it how. The night she stayed was in March. Aurora had had a difficult week, nothing serious, but tiring, and Lucia had spent 2 nights running later than usual. Daniel was there both nights, without a work excuse, without his phone lit up. On the third night, when Aurora fell asleep early and the house settled into the soft quiet of obligation-free Fridays, Daniel and Lucia found themselves in the small back sitting room, the one with books on every surface and a lamp with low light that no one had ever thought to replace with something more practical. They were on the sofa. She had a book she wasn't reading. He had his arms stretched along the back of the cushions, close without quite encircling her, the kind of deliberate nearness that was no longer discomfort, but something built on purpose. "Are you cold?" he asked. "A little." He closed the remaining distance. She set the book down. And it was natural, the way only things that have taken far too long to happen ever are. He drew her close slowly, one hand at her waist, the other at her arm. She turned toward him, her breathing already different, slower and deeper at once. "I have wanted to do this for a very long time," he said quietly, his voice low. "I know," she answered. "So have I." The lamp was still on when they kissed, this time without a hallway, without a pending goodbye, without reason to hurry or reason to stop. What remained of that night belonged only to them. There are things that don't need to be told in order to be understood. This is one of them. By morning, the kitchen smelled like coffee. Daniel had made it himself, without help, without instructions, using the Italian stovetop pot Lucia had shown him how to use one Tuesday weeks earlier, which he had quietly kept using ever since, without mentioning it to anyone. Lucia walked in with her hair loose and the same clothes as the night before, wearing the expression of someone who has slept well for the first time in a long time. "Coffee," said Daniel, nodding toward the cup already waiting. "Thank you." She sat at the small kitchen table. Neither of them spoke for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying. Because there are kinds of silence that are the opposite of empty. Aurora appeared at 9 with her cane, her elegant robe, and her lips unpainted, which was her domestic version of informality. She saw the two cups. She saw Lucia with her hair loose. She saw Daniel with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. She said nothing. She poured herself tea. She sat down. And then, with the patience of someone who can afford to wait for exactly the right moment, "Can anyone explain to me why there are 2 coffee cups and only one person who was here last night?" "Mama," said Daniel. "I'm asking about the coffee, Daniel. Nothing else." Lucia smiled into her cup. "The coffee is very good," she offered. "For context." "That's all the context I need," said Aurora, with the expression of someone who has won everything she wanted without having to ask for a thing. Epilogue. A year later, Lucia Vargas walked into the mansion at La Moraleja wearing an ivory dress, her hair pinned up simply, and her hands trembling, just slightly. Not from fear. By now, Lucia understood that trembling doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means something matters too much. The house was full of white flowers, warm light, and people trying to speak quietly, though no one quite managed it. The garden, the very garden where months ago she had walked not knowing whether she belonged in that world, was dressed for a small wedding. Small, by Aurora's definition, which meant 60 guests, a string quartet, 2 dessert tables, and a photographer Aurora had hired for discretion, though his camera was larger than several pieces of furniture in the house. "This isn't small," Lucia told her when she saw the decorations. Aurora, immaculate in a dark green dress, cane resting at her side like a royal scepter, raised an eyebrow. "Darling. Small is anything that doesn't include the people I actually like." Lucia tried to answer, but the laughter caught in her throat, because there was Daniel, at the end of the flower-lined path, not looking like the president of any corporate group. Not wearing the armor of the man who had learned to hide behind his name. He was there the way he had come to find her that morning in the market, just himself. Dark suit. Clear eyes. An emotion on his face so visible that even the most distracted guests fell quiet. Daniel Altamirano, the man who had once pretended to be a driver because he didn't know how to be vulnerable, was watching her the way a person watches when the entire world has narrowed to one figure walking toward them. Lucia walked slowly. And as she walked, she remembered everything. The first time she'd seen him polishing a windshield. The tote bag with the comfortable shoes he had carried without knowing how he'd ended up obeying. The market. The 3 cheeses. The rain. The soup. The gala. The lie. The pain. The forgiveness. And then everything that came after, when both of them had found the courage not to run. Because loving someone isn't only about finding the right person. Sometimes it's also about staying long enough to discover whether that person can learn to be better without you having to break in the process. Daniel had learned. Not quickly. Not perfectly. But genuinely. When Lucia reached him, Daniel took her hands. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "So are you," she answered. "Though you still have the face of someone who can't tell whether this is a wedding or a board meeting." He smiled. "I'm more nervous than I've ever been in any board meeting." "Good. That makes you human." "You make me human." In the front row, Aurora pressed a hand to her chest. Finally, she murmured. "He says something decent without me having to write the script." The officiant cleared his throat to reclaim the ceremony. He didn't fully succeed, because this was not a solemn, magazine-worthy wedding. It was something better. It was a wedding with a dangerously intelligent mother, a bride who had arrived at that house thinking she only needed a job, and a groom who had needed to lose her to understand that truth is not something you negotiate, manage, or postpone like an inconvenient meeting. When the moment came for vows, Daniel pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Lucia's eyes went wide. "You wrote vows." "I did." "Don't look so surprised, Daniel. The first time you made soup, you practically negotiated with the onion." The guests laughed. He did too. Then he looked at the paper, took a breath, and began. "Lucia, when you arrived at this house, I believed I had everything under control. My work. My family. My time. My feelings. All of it ordered, measured, safely out of reach. And then you showed up 7 minutes late, insulted my windshield technique, and asked me to carry a bag as though I had absolutely nothing more important to do." Lucia looked down, smiling. "And the truth is, I didn't," he continued. "Not at that moment. Not compared to what you were about to bring into my life. You taught me that waiting isn't wasting time. That caring isn't controlling. That loving someone doesn't mean protecting yourself from them every moment. And that a French onion soup can be more honest than any business presentation." Aurora nodded with great solemnity. "That is true." Daniel looked at her. "Mama. Sorry. Continue." The guests laughed again. Daniel looked back at Lucia. "I promise not to hide from you. I promise to tell the truth, even when it costs me. I promise to learn whatever needs to be learned, even if it involves kitchens, markets, and instructions I don't understand. And I promise to remember, every single day, that the best version of me didn't appear when a room full of people applauded me at a gala. It appeared when you looked at me like I was simply Daniel." Lucia's eyes were bright. When it was her turn, she didn't take out any paper. She never needed one. "Daniel, I came to this house looking for a job. Nothing more. I needed to pay rent, help my mother, and find a way to keep going after losing my grandmother. I wasn't looking for love. In fact, if anyone had told me I was going to fall in love with a supposed driver with a Roman emperor complex, I would have taken a different bus." Daniel pressed his lips together. "But it happened," she said. "I fell in love with the man who brought 3 cheeses because he didn't know which one was right. The man who moved furniture even though you could tell he'd never moved a single piece in his life. The man who listened when I talked about the things that hurt. And then it hurt to discover there was more. That there was everything else." A hush settled over the garden like a soft blanket. "But I learned something too. That a person can make a mistake and still choose to change. That love doesn't erase the wound, but it can build something honest on the other side of it. And that you, Daniel Altamirano, when you stop trying to control the world, are the most tender, most stubborn, and most exasperatingly lovable man I have ever known. That last part is debatable, Aurora murmured. It's not debatable, said Lucia, without looking away from Daniel. Aurora smiled. So did Daniel. So I promise to walk with you, said Lucia. Without disguises. Without convenient omissions. Without elegant half-truths. But with coffee every morning, French onion soup on cold days, and the freedom to tell you, every time it's needed, that you are being an insufferable CEO. I accept that clause, said Daniel. It's not your turn to answer. Sorry. The officiant decided to move things forward before he lost all control of the ceremony entirely. And minutes later, when Daniel and Lucia said yes, the whole house seemed to breathe differently. It wasn't an exaggerated kiss. It was slow. Deep. With the calm of two people who aren't starting from fantasy, but from something far more difficult, and far more beautiful. The truth. Aurora cried. She naturally denied it. Allergies, she said, as a tear made its way down her cheek. The flowers. No one dared to argue. The celebration lasted into the night. There was music, laughter, toasts, and a speech from Aurora that began as a family blessing and ended as an elegant threat directed at anyone who ever dared to make Lucia suffer. You are my daughter-in-law now, she said, raising her glass before the assembled guests. That means Daniel is still my son, but you take priority if he's ever an idiot. Mama, I'm right here. I'm practicing preventive justice. Lucia laughed so hard she had to press a hand against her stomach. Daniel noticed. He said nothing in that moment, but he looked at her, and she knew he understood. Later, when the guests had gone and the mansion had settled into the warm silence that houses hold after a celebration, Daniel found Lucia in the kitchen. The same kitchen. The one with the soup, the wooden spoon, the supposedly cold tea. Lucia was barefoot, her wedding dress lifted slightly so it wouldn't drag, eating a piece of bread and cheese as though she hadn't just married one of the wealthiest men in Madrid. Daniel leaned in the doorframe. My wife, stealing food in the kitchen. Your wife is hungry. There was an entire banquet an hour ago. Your wife has a very specific kind of hunger. Daniel looked at her, and something in his expression went soft. Lucia. She set the bread down. For the first time all evening, she seemed nervous. There's something I wanted to tell you, she said. But I didn't want to do it in front of everyone, or turn it into a performance. We'd already had enough of those, thanks to Aurora threatening half the family. Daniel stepped closer slowly. What is it? Lucia took a breath. She took his hand, and brought it gently to rest against her stomach. Daniel went still. The world, once again, reduced itself to a small silence. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to explain this to your mother without her buying out half a baby shop by morning, said Lucia with a trembling smile. But I think we're going to need one more room in this house. Daniel looked down at his hand. Then back at her eyes. Are you? Lucia nodded. Yes. Daniel didn't speak. For 3 full seconds, he couldn't. And for those who knew Daniel Altamirano, that was still, and would always be, a historic event. Then he let out a laugh, broken, awed, disbelieving, and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that was almost clumsy, as though Lucia had suddenly become the center of everything fragile and everything sacred at once. We're going to have a baby, he whispered. Or a girl. Or a girl with your temper. If she comes out with your personality, we're moving. If she comes out with my personality, my mother will say she's a gift to humanity. And the terrifying part is she'll believe it. Daniel laughed against her hair. Then pulled back just enough to kiss her, on the forehead, on the cheek, on the mouth. Small, scattered kisses, full of a happiness that didn't know how to behave. Thank you, he said. Lucia looked at him. Don't thank me like I've sent you a quarterly report. I don't know what to say. That's new. I'm learning. He paused. You're going to need me to learn a great many things. Diapers. Bottles. Not sleeping. Not controlling everything. Daniel pretended to consider this. That last one sounds harder than the diapers. It is. From the hallway came a sound. Both of them turned. Aurora stood in the kitchen doorway, elegant robe, cane in hand, with the expression of someone who had heard absolutely nothing. Except everything. One more room, she asked. Lucia closed her eyes. Daniel murmured, "We're finished." Aurora moved slowly toward them. For once, she didn't speak immediately. She looked at Lucia. She looked at Daniel. Then she looked at his hand still resting gently against Lucia's stomach. Her eyes filled with tears. This time she didn't even try to blame the flowers. "Am I going to be a grandmother?" she asked, in a voice smaller than usual. Lucia nodded. Aurora brought a hand to her lips. Then she did something neither of them expected. She pulled Lucia into a hug, tight, real, the embrace of a woman holding not just her daughter-in-law, but the person who had brought life back to a house that had been breathing on habit for years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Please don't make me cry," said Lucia. "You're pregnant. You can blame hormones for anything now." Daniel laughed, a genuine, emotional sound. Aurora pulled back and looked at him. "And you? Tomorrow we're buying books." "Books?" "Many books. On parenting. On sleep schedules. On nutrition. On how not to become an insufferable father. That last one doesn't exist. Then I'll write it myself." Lucia leaned her forehead against Daniel's shoulder and laughed. And in that kitchen, where a powerful man had once learned to slice onions because a woman who thought he was the driver had asked him to, another story began. A smaller one. More intimate. Louder, certainly. With sleepless nights and coffee cups and arguments about cribs, and Aurora buying impossibly tiny clothes as though preparing for a coronation. And Daniel discovering that no empire, no company, no applause in any gala hall compared to resting his hand on the stomach of the woman he loved and knowing, truly knowing, that life had finally won over fear. Months later, a daughter was born. They named her Alba, because Aurora declared that a little girl who arrived after so much darkness deserved to be named for the dawn. Lucia pretended to think about it. Daniel pretended the decision had been democratic. Everyone knew the truth. In that family, when Aurora spoke in that particular tone, even the newborns complied. The first time Daniel held his daughter, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, tiny, furious at the world for the indignity of being born, fists clenched, wearing an expression that, according to Aurora, was clearly inherited from the Altamirano side. From the hospital bed, Lucia watched him. Tired and happy. "She has your frown," she said. "She has your talent for arriving whenever she feels like it. She was born exactly when she wanted." "Exactly." Aurora, sitting beside them, gently touched the baby's blanket with one finger. "She has character," she declared. "She's 3 hours old," said Daniel. "And it's already clear." Alba opened her eyes, just barely. Daniel looked at her the way you look at something no manual in the world can prepare you for. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm your father." Lucia smiled. "He used to be a driver." Daniel looked up. "We are not telling her that part." Aurora raised her head. "Of course we are telling her that part. It's the foundation of this family." Lucia laughed, quietly, so as not to startle the baby. Daniel looked at his daughter. Then at Lucia. Then at Aurora. And understood, finally, that this was his life now, not perfect, not quiet, not controlled, but real. Terribly real. And so much better than anything he had ever imagined, back when he believed that living meant having everything under control. Because in the end, Daniel Altamirano hadn't lost control of his life that afternoon when a woman arrived late to the mansion and mistook him for the driver. He found it. And that is where this story ends. Or rather, that is where the part begins that doesn't need to be told, because it belongs only to them. If this story made you laugh, made you sigh, or made you believe just a little more in second chances, leave us a like and subscribe to the channel. It's the simplest way to support this little corner where we keep telling stories to help you step away from the world for a while. And now, we want to know something. Would you want Alba to inherit Lucia's fire, Daniel's intensity, or Donna Aurora's dangerously brilliant mind? Tell us in the comments.